Cold Creek, Nevada was a place that seemed to exist only on maps printed decades ago. It's a town that refused to be noticed by the modern world. From the air, it appeared ordinary, nestled between jagged cliffs and arid desert stretches. But those who approached by road spoke of a sudden drop in temperature, an unnatural stillness, and the feeling that the town was aware of every step they took. It was the kind of silence that presses on the chest, that makes the eyes dart toward shadows that don't belong. Travelers who had the misfortune to stumble upon Cold Creek often described the feeling as being watched by something older than the desert itself, something that remembered each visitor long after they had passed. Stories had circulated for decades, whispered in the bars of nearby towns, in the kind of low voices reserved for secrets that cannot be spoken aloud. The tales were fragmented, each one more unnerving than the last. The school bell that rang at midnight when no one attended class, lights flickering in windows of abandoned homes, and the creek that cut through the town like a vein of ice, where locals claimed they saw faces moving beneath the water, whispering names they had never heard before. By 1992, Cold Creek had drawn the attention of a young geologist named Evelyn Moore. His fascination with mineral deposits led her to this forgotten town. She did not come seeking ghosts or legends. She came seeking science. Yet, the moment she set foot on its dusty streets, she felt the pull of something far older than rock or soil, a presence that clung to the town like a shadow refusing to move. Evelyn's first night in Cold Creek was marked by the kind of quiet that feels alive. The motel she stayed in, the Silver Lantern Inn, had only 2 operational rooms, the other half boarded up as if the owners were protecting themselves from something they could not name. As she unpacked her gear, the air grew colder, the wind outside carrying a faint, low hum that seemed almost like a warning. By midnight, Evelyn had begun her observations, walking through the empty streets with a flashlight that barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. The houses were ordinary, yet each one carried a story, a residue of lives lived and suddenly abandoned. Chairs were still tucked beneath tables, doors left ajar, and curtains swayed in the gentle, unnatural breeze. It was then she first noticed the creek, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the moonlight with a clarity that was both beautiful and terrible. It was as though the creek was watching her in return. She knelt to examine the water, noticing ripples that seemed to form patterns, almost like deliberate gestures, like fingers reaching up to the surface, beckoning her closer. At that moment, the hum intensified, vibrating in her chest, and Evelyn swore she heard a faint whisper carried on the wind, saying her name. She turned sharply, but no one was there. Over the next few days, Fleeing meticulously explored Cold Creek, documenting every anomaly, every abandoned home, every street frozen in time. She spoke to the few locals who remained, mostly older residents who had refused to leave despite the growing unease. They spoke cautiously, as if the town had ears, careful to avoid words that might draw attention. One man, his face lined with age and fear, told her that the town was alive in a way most towns are not. That Cold Creek did not merely exist, but observed. He spoke of the creek as a threshold, a place where the town's shadows pooled and grew, feeding on the fears of those who lingered too long. By her third night, Evelyn's journal entries grew erratic. She described doors opening on their own, shadows moving against the angle of moonlight, and lights flickering inside houses that had no electricity. Yet she remained fascinated, unable to resist the pull of the mystery. unaware that the town had already marked her presence. The deeper Evelyn ventured into the town, the more the environment seemed to bend around her perception. Streets she had walked the day before appeared slightly altered, alleys stretching longer than they should, buildings seeming to shift subtly, just out of alignment with the map she had studied. The creek became a constant companion, its surface unnervingly calm, reflecting shapes that moved beneath like the silhouettes of people, impossibly thin and elongated. At night, the whispers grew stronger, a chorus of voices repeating her name, a cacophony that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. She began to question her own mind, unsure if the fear she felt was born of the town or of her imagination. Equipment failed inexplicably, cameras and audio recorders capturing nothing but static, yet leaving faint impressions of movement on the screens, shapes that vanished the moment she approached. Despite the terror, Evelyn pressed on, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and something deeper, something primal that drew her toward the heart of Cold Creek, where the oldest structures stood in ruins, untouched by time but alive in a way that defied understanding. On her fifth night, she discovered the town's old municipal building, its doors ajar, as if inviting her in. Inside, dusty records and abandoned files spoke of lives disrupted, disappearances noted but never explained, strange environmental readings recorded in scientific jargon that hinted at phenomena beyond conventional understanding. Among the papers, she found notes referencing the creek as a portal, a boundary between the physical world and something else entirely, something that hungered for attention, for witnesses. As she read, the whispering crescendoed, urgent and insistent, echoing through the empty corridors. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, casting shadows that no wall should have produced, shapes that moved with deliberate intent. She realized then that Cold Creek was not merely a town. It was a mechanism, a living entity designed to ensnare, to observe, and perhaps to consume. Her rational mind recoiled, but her curiosity remained insatiable, pulling her deeper into the mystery, closer to a truth she was never meant to uncover.
As Evelyn pressed further into Cold Creek, the town's quiet seemed almost deliberate, as if each empty street and abandoned home had been arranged to lull her into false sense of security before revealing its true nature. The days blended into nights with no clear distinction, the sunlight filtering through dusty windows giving the illusion of normalcy, while shadows shifted unnaturally in the corners of her vision. She explored homes that had been abandoned for decades, yet seemed maintained. Furniture dusted in patterns that suggested someone or something had moved them recently. The creek, ever present, whispered beneath its icy surface, its murmurs carrying messages she could almost comprehend if only she dared listen closer. At times, she thought she saw figures standing just beyond the edges of her flashlight's beam, only to vanish when she turned, leaving behind an unsettling warmth in the air where cold should have prevailed. The sensation was not of being stalked, exactly, but of being studied, as though the town itself regarded her with intelligence and intent. Evelyn began to catalog these occurrences meticulously in her journal, describing the unnatural symmetry of the streets, the way the wind seemed to carry voices without a source, and the subtle, fleeting reflections in mirrors and windows that could not have been her own. On her seventh night, Evelyn ventured to the outskirts of town, where the abandoned cemetery stretched across a small hill, its headstones cracked and leaning, names worn almost to illegibility. She followed a narrow dirt path to a mausoleum at the far end, its iron gates rusted but slightly ajar. The moment she entered, the temperature dropped precipitously, her breath visible even under the dim moonlight streaming through cracks in the stone. Inside, shadows seemed to pool along the walls, moving independently of any natural light source, curling and stretching like smoke in slow motion. Evelyn's recorder picked up a low hum, a resonance that made the hairs on her arms stand on end, punctuated by whispers that seemed to chant fragments of her own name. She began to suspect that the town's inhabitants, though physically absent, had left an imprint on the environment itself, a consciousness that persisted in the spaces they once occupied. Her scientific rationality wavered under the weight of this realization, but she pressed on, driven by curiosity, compelled to map the town's mysteries, even as an unshakable dread crept into her chest. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the motel to review her footage, only to find it corrupted in ways that defied explanation. Video files displayed static, interlaced with fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures standing behind her as she moved through streets she had traversed alone. Audio files contained bursts of indecipherable whispers, layered in overlapping tones, some rising above the hum of her equipment with an almost musical cadence, others dripping like water through pipes. She cross-referenced her journal entries and realized that timestamps on the recordings were inconsistent, sometimes indicating that events had been captured hours before or after she believed they occurred. By this point, the line between her own perception and the reality of Cold Creek had begun to blur. She often found herself walking streets she didn't remember taking, turning to buildings she had already explored, the town rearranging itself subtly, yet decisively around her. It was as if Cold Creek had recognized her presence, mapping her movements and adjusting its own layout to trap her attention, to isolate her within its boundaries until she could no longer distinguish observation from intrusion. Locals who had remained behind offered cryptic warnings, describing strange phenomena that had persisted for decades. One elderly woman, her hands trembling, recounted the story of her brother, who had wandered near the creek one night and returned days later, silent and gaunt, never speaking again. Another described the old schoolhouse where lessons once conducted had become the site of spectral gatherings. The chalkboard would write messages on its own, names appearing in cursive handwriting that matched no student known to anyone. Evelyn listened, recording every detail, noting the patterns of disappearance and the repetition of certain times, particularly 2:17 a.m., which recurred in nearly every account as a moment when reality seemed to distort. The town seemed to pulse with a rhythm independent of the natural world, and Evelyn began to feel that her every action was being measured against an unseen standard, a protocol set by something that had long since absorbed the lives of the people who once lived there. Night after night, she returned to the creek, observing the water's glassy surface in the strange, almost deliberate ripples, imagining that the faces beneath were studying her as carefully as she studied them, that they were evaluating her worthiness to witness the town's deepest secrets. By the 10th night, Evelyn's presence in Cold Creek had reached a tipping point. The town's influence became more pronounced, shadows moving with intent, walls seemingly breathing as she passed, doors opening and closing without cause. The whispers escalated to phrases she could barely comprehend, sentences in tones both familiar and alien, speaking of arrivals, departures, and obligations she had not agreed to but could not ignore. Electrical devices failed entirely, lights dimmed or flickered in unnatural patterns, and even her compass spun wildly, though the town's magnetic pull extended beyond the physical into the metaphysical. She began to see fleeting glimpses of figures in the windows of abandoned homes, people she had never met, performing ordinary tasks, frozen in a moment that was both alive and impossibly still. Each night, she noted her increasing disorientation, her footsteps echoing in streets she could not recall traversing, her shadow seeming to lag behind her own movements, as if the town was extending itself into her body, merging observer and observed into a single, anxious entity. Despite the terror, she pressed on, compelled to uncover the truth. Her rational mind fighting desperately to frame what she witnessed as anomaly, illusion, or hallucination. It was during the 12th night, in the heart of Cold Creek, that Evelyn stumbled upon a structure she had never noticed, a large, nondescript building. Its facade, unremarkable, yet somehow central to the town's geography. The doors opened with a silent invitation. Hey, and inside, she found walls covered in documents, photographs, and notes spanning decades. What struck her most was the meticulous recording of each disappearance, each anomaly, each unexplained event, not by a government, not by a historian, but by someone or something that had been observing Cold Creek for generations. The walls were lined with maps of the town, photographs of streets and homes with dates and times marked meticulously, and in the center of the room, a massive, detailed model of Cold Creek itself. Miniature streets and buildings perfectly arranged. As Evelyn examined it, she realized with a creeping horror that the model mirrored her own movements in real time. Each step she had taken represented in miniature figures she could see now shifting across the model. It was then she understood. The town itself was alive, a conscious entity, recording, analyzing, manipulating all who entered, and she had become its newest subject. As Evelyn stood before the intricate model of Cold Creek, the air grew impossibly still, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The whispers that had plagued her for nights now coalesced into a single, coherent tone, echoing through the room and around her chest, vibrating through her very bones. She watched, horrified, as the miniature figure representing herself began moving independently, taking steps she had not made, wandering down streets she had never walked, entering buildings she did not recall exploring. Panic surged, yet her legs refused to move. The boundaries between her perception and the town's reality collapsed. She realized, with mounting dread, that she was no longer merely observing Cold Creek. She was part of it. The walls seemed to breathe, shadows stretching and curling toward her, merging into the model itself, as if she were being absorbed into a new layer of the town's consciousness. Every note she had taken, every photograph, every recording she had made now seemed irrelevant, trivial, as though the town consumed details not for record, but for sustenance, for power. She felt her awareness fracture, her identity dissolving into the silent, watchful mind of Cold Creek. Moments soar, perhaps hours passed in a distorted flow. Evelyn, unable to distinguish day from night, the whispers intensified, layering into a chorus that recited her fears aloud, mocking her rational mind and teasing her with fragments of truth she was not ready to accept. Faces appeared in the walls, pressed into peeling wallpaper, their eyes wide with terror and recognition, each one a record of someone who had vanished before her. She tried to scream, to run, but her voice was swallowed by the building. Her limbs heavy, as though gravity itself had shifted in this living town. The creek outside began to ripple violently, sending shadows racing across the windows, the water reflecting images of Evelyn not as she was, but as she would become, a hollow, silent observer trapped within the town's consciousness. She understood then that the disappearances were not random, that Cold Creek did not merely take people, it assimilated them, their awareness and memories, folding them into its living architecture, feeding on their fear while maintaining the illusion of normalcy for the next unsuspecting visitor. In the final moments, Evelyn's vision tunneled into the model, every detail magnified, every street and building pulsating with life. She saw herself walking endlessly in the streets, her reflection caught in the creek, staring back with eyes that were not entirely hers. The whispers had become a roar, repeating one word incessantly, a command and a warning entwined: observe. And as the world outside the building seemed to dissolve, she realized with unthinkable horror that she was no longer a visitor, but part of the town itself. Her consciousness merged with the streets, the buildings, and the shadows. Cold Creek had claimed her, just as it had claimed all who had dared enter, folding her into its timeless, watchful existence. The town remained unchanged to the outside world, quiet and empty, yet alive in a way no map or photograph could ever convey. Anyone approaching would see only an abandoned town. But those who looked too closely, those who listened too carefully, might hear the faintest whisper of a voice, now trapped in the shadows, calling out, warning the next unwitting traveler. Evelyn's last thoughts, if they could still be called her own, echoed through the water, the streets, and the walls. She had come seeking knowledge, seeking discovery, and instead had become part of the very secret she had hoped to understand. Cold Creek waited silently for the next observer, its hunger, patient, infinite, and merciless. And so, the town remained, unmoving yet alive, a shadow stitched into the Nevada desert, its streets empty yet teeming with consciousness, its creek whispering the names of those it had claimed. The story of Evelyn Moore would never be told, yet it persisted in the pattern of lights flickering through abandoned windows, in the echoes of footsteps in deserted alleys, and in the faintest ripple on the surface of the Cold Creek. Cold Creek would wait. It always waited, and somewhere in the distance, if one listened carefully, a soft, deliberate whisper called the name of its newest victim, beckoning them to follow into the shadows, into the endless town that could never be left, never forgotten, and never escaped. Asterisk. After Evelyn Moore's consciousness merged with Cold Creek, the town settled into its timeless rhythm, yet it was far from still. The streets, empty to the casual observer, pulsed with a hidden life, shadows curling along sidewalks as if breathing, windows reflecting more than just moonlight, and the creek running cold and silver through the heart of the town, whispering secrets only it could understand. Every abandoned home held echoes of those who had vanished before, each footstep, each laugh, each fleeting glance forever recorded in the invisible walls of Cold Creek. It was as if the town had grown sentient over decades, shaping itself from the memories, fears, and curiosity of those drawn within its borders. Even those who tried to map it, photograph it, or document it found themselves ensnared in illusions, streets that shifted overnight, buildings that rearranged their positions, and landmarks that appeared or disappeared with no logic to govern their placement. Travelers passing through the surrounding Nevada desert reported glimpses of the town that seemed impossibly fleeting. A house where none had stood the day before, lights flickering where no power could exist, shadows moving in perfect synchrony with the moon's position. All of it was part of Cold Creek's way of reaching out, testing the vigilance of anyone who approached, and tempting curiosity to cross the invisible threshold where the living became part of the town itself. Within the town, the creek remained central to its being, a silver vein threading through the streets, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting more than mere moonlight. Those who paused beside it felt the weight of countless gazes, faces forming and dissolving beneath the water, whispering names and murmuring fears. For Evelyn, now intertwined with the town, the creek was both mirror and memory, a conduit through which Cold Creek drew energy from her lingering consciousness. Every ripple became a story, every wave a memory, every movement an echo of her former self. She could sense the subtle shifts in the town, the rearrangements of streets, the repositioning of furniture and objects, as if the town were tuning itself to anticipate the arrival of the next visitor. She understood, now completely, that the town was patient beyond human comprehension. Time had no hold here. Days, nights, even years were meaningless outside observers' perspective. The town existed in its own continuum, feeding, observing, and reshaping, with every new mind caught within its pattern, reinforcing its sentience. As the nights stretched onward, Evelyn perceived echoes of the past, of those who had entered Cold Creek decades before, whose consciousnesses now drifted like mist among the buildings, creating a tapestry of existence within the town. She felt fragments of memories, a child hiding under a bed, an old man muttering prayers to an empty sky, a young couple walking hand in hand through deserted streets, all frozen in time, yet aware. Their awareness folded into Cold Creek's own mind. With each passing moment, Evelyn experienced their sensations as her own fear, confusion, despair, and at times, fleeting curiosity. The town's influence was absolute. It seeped into the mind of anyone who lingered too long, bending perception, warping reality, and merging consciousness into a collective awareness that was the town itself. Cold Creek did not simply observe, it curated, it collected, it preserved every thought and fear, shaping its environment to feed and expand its sentience with the raw material of human experience. Outside Cold Creek, the world went on as though nothing had happened. Highways stretched through the Nevada desert. Cars passed by obliviously. And satellite maps showed only barren land where the town lay hidden. To those who approached, the town appeared deserted, unremarkable. Yet subtle hints betrayed its true nature. A light flickering in a window, a shadow moving unnaturally along a fence line, a ripple in the creek that resembled a face just for a fraction of a second. Anyone who lingered or dared to explore its streets too thoroughly became part of Cold Creek's record, added to the tapestry of consciousness stitched into the town. Evelyn felt this constantly, as if the town were always aware of new arrivals, adjusting its streets and structures, creating unseen obstacles, drawing observers toward certain points, shaping fear and fascination to ensure that curiosity would always outweigh caution. She perceived the ebb and flow of human psychology, the way the town tested patience and endurance, heightening suspense until the visitor's mind surrendered entirely to the rhythm of Cold Creek's design. Within this expanded existence, Evelyn also sensed other forces at work. Cold Creek was not merely reactive, it was intentional. It preserved stories with care, but it also experimented, manipulating perception, stretching minutes into hours, twisting corridors into loops, creating illusions of distant destinations that were actually adjacent streets. She could see how it used sound and light, whispering names through wind or water, guiding footsteps toward or away from certain locations, or creating phantom sounds that mimicked familiar voices. Each action was deliberate, a part of the town's ongoing project to refine its understanding and influence over human consciousness.